I stood at the pier's edge, watching the crew load equipment onto what must have been the most expensive submarine I'd ever seen outside of a military station. The Absol Clipper resembled something NASA might build if they opted to explore the water rather than space. All elegant curves and strengthened titanium plating that reflected the port lights. 3 weeks had gone when the encrypted email arrived in my inbox. The sender's address was a strange string of letters that I couldn't decipher, but the offer seemed genuine enough. $50,000 for a 2-week deep-sea research mission, including expenses, the kind of money that would erase out my education loans and afford me 6 months to find actual job. When I told my academic advisor that I was taking the position, he described it as career suicide. Sarah, you do not accept mysterious offers from unidentified sources. This is how people disappear. Dr. Peterson had a point, but he wasn't the one watching his research funding dwindle. As student loan payments continued to come in every month, the email had been brief. GPS coordinates of San Diego Harbor, a departure time, instructions to carry personal diving gear and prepare for 2 weeks at sea. There was no mention of the real research objectives or the materials we'd be gathering, just the enigmatic signature line. Deep seas contain deep secrets. I should have erased it. Instead, I spent 3 days examining the coordinates, discovering they pointed to a part of the Pacific that no genuine research teams had mentioned. Too far from traditional shipping lines and too deep for most commercial operations. The type of location that makes oceanographers anxious. A man arrived from the ship's gangway, his boots firmly planted on the pier. Weathered skin, gray beard, and a permanent squint from years of looking into ocean spray. He moved with the delicate balance of someone who has spent more time on deck than on land. You are Campbell. It was not a question. I'm Sarah Campbell. Marine biology. I extended my hand, attempting to convey more confidence than I felt. He shook quickly, solid grip, then let go. Captain Matthew Torres, you are the last to arrive. Matthew turned and headed back to the ship without waiting for my reaction. I grabbed my duffel bag and followed him up the gangway, my boots clanking against the metal grating. The deck was pristine, every rope coiled with military precision, every surface polished to a dull gloss that wouldn't reflect harmful light. At depth, impressive setup, I murmured, running my fingers over the railing. The metal beneath my fingers felt cold and sturdy. It had better be. We're going areas most ships can't reach. Matthew came to a stop near what appeared to be the bridge's entrance. Your accommodations are located below deck, 3rd door on the left. The galleys are at the end of the passageway. We'll make introductions once we're underway. He began to walk away and then hesitated. Campbell, forget what you think you signed up for. This is not a university research cruise. I wanted to inquire what he meant, but Matthew had already disappeared into the bridge. The sound of engines rumbling to life beneath my feet indicated that we'd be moving shortly. Whether I comprehended the situation or not, below deck, the ship felt more like a cutting-edge laboratory than a traditional warship. LED strips supplied crisp, white lighting throughout passageways crowded with unfamiliar equipment. The air tasted recycled and had the faint chemical scent of advanced life support systems. My rooms were a small but well-designed cabin with a narrow bunk, a desk fitted into the wall, and storage compartments secured with electronic keypads. Someone had left the ship's manifest on the desk. 8 crew members altogether, including myself. Most of the names were unfamiliar to me, but I recognized Cheryl Anderson from her published work on marine microorganisms. I put my luggage in the storage containers and made my way to the galley. A woman with short brown hair was making coffee, her actions smooth and precise. She looked up when I walked in. You must be a new biologist. I am Cheryl Anderson. Sarah Campbell. I know your work on deep-sea bacteria. Fantastic thing. Cheryl poured a second cup without asking and handed it to me. Thanks. I have to say, I'm not sure why they required two marine biologists on this trip. 2. The manifest simply shows my specialty. Check again. They've labeled me as a microbiologist, yet my background includes broad marine biology. Cheryl leaned against the counter and studied my face. How much were you told about this mission? Almost nothing. You're the same. I received the email 3 weeks ago. Coordinates, departure time, and payment details. Nothing regarding objectives or methods. She had a sip of coffee. My department head believes I am mad. Mine too. The ship lurched slightly as we moved away from the dock. I could see the harbor lights passing by through the small porthole. There's no turning back now. Have you met the rest of the crew? I asked. Several of them. Most of them are engineers. A couple of individuals whose job descriptions I don't understand. Everyone appears to be on a need-to-know basis. Cheryl put down her cup. The captain does not exactly promote social engagement. I noticed. Isn't this a really talkative guy? I tried to ask him about the research protocols this morning. He said I'd find out when we got to depth. She paused. Whatever that means. The engine shifted pitch, and I felt the ship change course. We were now headed out into open sea, leaving the protective port behind. The mild swaying motion would become more obvious as we approached the ocean swells. The ship's equipment is fantastic. I mentioned that several of the gadgets in the carters appear like they belong in a government facility. I was thinking the exact same thing. The pressure suits alone are probably more expensive than my annual wage. Cheryl refills her coffee cup. Makes you wonder who is actually supporting this mission. Before I could react, a voice came through the ship's intercom system. Matthew's voice is crisp and authoritative. All crew to the main deck. Briefing in 5 minutes. Cheryl and I exchanged eyes. Finally, some answers. The main deck had been turned into a meeting space, with folding chairs arranged in a rough circle. When we arrived, 7 other people had already taken their seats. 6 men and 1 woman I had not yet met. The engineers appeared to have previous experience working on ships. Weathered hands and functional apparel. The others were difficult to read. Matthew stood in the center of the circle, clutching 1 manila envelope in each hand. He had changed into a dark blue outfit, which made him appear more official and military. We're currently 2 hours out from San Diego, going toward the coordinates I've set into the navigation system. Our target is around 1,200 meters southwest, in international waters. He handed out envelopes to each crew member. These outline your unique responsibilities for this assignment. Please do not open them till I give the command. I turned the envelope over in my hands. My name was typed on a plain white label. Nothing else. The packet was sealed with what seemed to be security tape. What is our research objective? Inquired one of the engineers, a man with graying temples and calloused hands. Deep sea sample collection. Geological and biological specimens from target depth. Matthew's response appeared rehearsed. Each of your envelopes has specific protocols for your area of responsibility. Target depth. Cheryl leaned forward in her chair. What is the depth of our conversation? Matthew glanced at her for a long time before responding. Deeper than you've ever been. That's not exactly a response, I said. It is the only answer you are receiving right now. Matthew's tone indicated that the discussion was concluded. We'll get to the coordinates in around 18 hours. Get some rest, acquaint yourself with the ship's layout, and gather your stuff. Questions concerning specific protocols can wait until you've finished reading your assignments." He started to walk away, but paused. "One additional thing. This is a closed task. No communication with outside parties until we return to the port. The radio equipment is solely intended for emergency usage." "What about checking in with our institutions?" asked the woman I hadn't met. "Already handled. Your supervisors have been alerted that you will be out of contact during the adventure." Matthew approached the bridge's entrance. "Dinner is at 1900 hours. We'll do another briefing tomorrow morning." The meeting ended shortly. Crew members dispersed to various areas of the ship with their sealed packets. I caught Cheryl's glance and pulled my head to the stern. She nodded and accompanied me to a quiet area on the deck. The harbor was far behind us now, just a faint glow on the horizon. We were surrounded by dark water that reached to the very boundary of the visible world. The ship's engines kept a steady rhythm, propelling us to coordinates I couldn't find on any standard oceanographic chart. "This whole setup feels wrong," Cheryl stated quietly. "Professional research expeditions don't work like this." "I know, but the money and equipment are real," I said, hefting the sealed package. "Maybe once we read these things will make more sense." "Maybe." Cheryl gazed out at the Black Lake. "Perhaps we just committed the biggest mistake of our careers." I did not have an answer for that. The ship resumed its steady journey toward unknown coordinates, transporting 8 strangers who had all received the same unusual offer. Whatever awaited us in the deep ocean, we'd discover together. The motors hummed beneath our feet, pushing us further from the shore with each passing minute. I plastered my face into the monitor screen, watching the depth gauge steadily drop as we began our plunge into the deep ocean trench. It had been 18 hours since we had left the port lights, and Matthew had finally given the order to commence the dive sequence. Once we had reached the target coordinates, the sealed envelope remained unread on the desk beside me. His instructions had been clear about waiting until he gave the command, which he'd specified would happen once we reached depth. Round me, the ship hummed with the controlled energy of a precise machine. Banks of panels displayed data from hundreds of sensors, recording everything from hull pressure to water temperature. As we descended through the ocean depths, this has always been my favorite aspect of deep-sea research. The gradual descent through areas most humans would never witness. Each layer reveals new insights into our planet's hidden geography. The exterior cameras captured the top ocean's distinctive blue-green hue. Sunlight is still penetrating enough to produce the dreamy underwater cathedral look. But as we approached 3,000 feet and entered what marine biologists call the twilight zone, something seemed off. The water seemed empty. Throughout my graduate studies, I had made scores of descents into this depth range, and the twilight zone was generally populated by bioluminescent species. Jellyfish flashing with electric blue patterns. Lanternfish are forming galaxies of living stars. Siphonophores trail lights like underwater Christmas decorations. The cameras should have captured a light spectacle that exceeded anything mankind had devised. Instead, the water surrounding us was dark and lifeless, as if we had dropped through liquid obsidian. "Cheryl," I hollered across the equipment bay where she was putting up her sampling station. "Are you seeing this on your monitors?" She looked up from adjusting her microscope, her face perplexed. "Seeing what?" "The entire absence of life. We should be surrounded by bioluminescence. At this depth." Cheryl proceeded to the bank of external cameras, cycling through several viewing angles. Her frown intensified as she looked through the feeds. That is odd. Even in low productivity areas, vertical migration is likely to occur. James, the sonar operator, turned in his chair. We're getting some unusual readings from the sonar array. Contacts appear for a few seconds before disappearing completely. I proceeded to a station studying the sonar. Display blips of varying sizes appeared on the screen. Much like ghosts, some are as enormous as whales, while others are little and darting. However, when the sonar swept back over the same region moments later, there was nothing there. I inquired about a possible equipment malfunction. We ran a comprehensive diagnostics check before beginning our descent. Everything checks out. James adjusted the sonar range, but the phantom contacts kept appearing and disappearing. It's as if something out there refuses to be tracked. The ship's intercom sprang to life. Matthew's voice had the same authoritative tone as the prior briefing. All stations disclose their status. We're approaching 5,000 feet. One by one, the crew members checked in. Engineering reported normal operations. Navigation confirmed that we were on track for the target coordinates. The hull integrity sensors were all green across the board. Everything was working perfectly, which added to the eerie atmosphere created by the empty ocean surrounding us. Cheryl went back to her sample station and deployed the first collection probe. The robotic arm emerged from the ship's hull, its camera capturing a close-up shot as it drew water into a sterile container. The sample appeared to be totally normal, clear, deep ocean water with the typical microscopic particles floating in the stream. She placed the sample in the analysis chamber and bent over the microscope. I looked at her face as she focused the lens, expecting to see the usual concentration that comes with inspecting new specimens. Instead, her expression shifted from confusion to concern. "Sarah, come look at this." I joined her at the microscope station. "What do you see?" "Look at the sample." I peered into the eyepiece, adjusting the focus. The sample, which had been transparent just minutes before, was now entirely black, as if someone had blended ink into the jar. However, the transition was not uniform. Tendrils of darkness moved through the water like smoke, in designs that appeared almost organic. One proposed equipment contamination, despite the fact that I had observed her following normal sterilizing measures. That is what I thought. Cheryl walked to a second microscope and created a control sample with distilled water from the ship's laboratory supplies. But look at this. The control sample was crystal clear, exactly as it should be. The ship's interior systems were unaffected by whatever was going on with the ocean water. "Try another collection," I said. Cheryl used the sampling arm again, this time gathering water from a depth of 6,000 feet. We watched the robotic probe extend and retract, and the collection chamber closed with a gentle click that carried through the hull. The new sample appeared to be identical to the first. Transparent, regular deep ocean water. However, within 3 minutes of entering the ship's laboratory environment, the same metamorphosis began. Black tendrils formed like veins across the sample, spreading and condensing until the entire container looked like it held liquid coal. "This doesn't make sense," Cheryl muttered, running more diagnostics on her equipment. "The chemical composition reveals normal saline content, expected mineral concentrations, and conventional deep water properties. Yet optically it transforms into something completely different." The intercom crackled again at 10,000 feet. "Engineering. Report on electrical systems." Robert responded from below deck, mentioning minor variations in the auxiliary power grid. "There are no deviations from standard parameters. However, the magnetic field readings are very variable." I looked at the depth gauge. 10,000 feet took us deep into the bathagic zone, the domain of endless darkness, where the pressure would crush an unprotected human body in milliseconds. The external cameras now showed nothing but dark water, illuminated by the ship's strong lead arrays. "James, are you still receiving those phantom sonar contacts?" I asked. He nodded grudgingly. "More of them now. Larger ones, too. Some of these readings indicate objects the size of blue whales, yet their movements do not correspond to any known marine species." "What types of movements?" "Perfect geometric patterns, straight lines, 90-degree twists, and formations that appear nearly coordinated. The temperature in the equipment bay appeared to decrease a few degrees, but the climate control systems remained stable." I checked the external temperature sensors, and my gut tightened. Readings were drastically changing. One moment shows the typical near-freezing temperatures of deep water, followed by spikes to levels that should have been unthinkable at this depth. "Cheryl, do you notice these temperature anomalies?" She looked at her instruments and did a double take. "That cannot be correct. The sensors detect heat spikes of 40 C. At this depth, that would necessitate significant geothermal activity or equipment failure. Multiple independent sensors cannot fail in the same way." She pulled up additional readings on her screen. "The pressure sensors also fluctuate, but not in response to temperature variations. It seems like the water around us is unstable." The ship resumed its drop, passing 15,000 feet rather than 20,000. The crew's chatter over the intercom became more subdued, punctuated by reports of minor electrical anomalies that grew less minor by the hour. Lights flickered down the corridors. Computer systems required more frequent restarts. The engineers' words were tinged with apprehension as they attempted to maintain their professionalism. Captain Robert initiated communication. "We are seeing power fluctuations in the main electrical grid. Might want to slow the fall till we can diagnose the issue." Matthew responded immediately and firmly. "Descent continues as scheduled. Run diagnostics on the secondary systems." I exchanged looks with Cheryl before diving deeper. Standard deep-sea protocol required that any electrical anomalies be investigated. The pressure above 25,000 feet could turn small faults into catastrophic failures. "Captain Torres, I've talked to the intercom. This is Campbell. We are experiencing serious equipment faults in the laboratory systems. Request permission to halt the descent and investigate." The intercom remained silent for a few seconds. Matthew's voice returned with a tone that discouraged further conversation. "All stations remain operational. We are behind schedule." "For what reason are you behind schedule?" "Our sealed packets containing mission specifications remained unopened. Our exact intentions still a mystery." But something in Matthew's speech suggested that he was working under pressures that none of us understood. At 25,000 feet, the ship's external lights started to flicker. The lead arrays that illuminated the water surrounding us flickered and brightened in random patterns, generating odd shadows that appeared to move independently of our movement through the water. I studied the exterior cameras, attempting to figure out what I was seeing. The shadows were not behaving as they should. They twisted and curled through the water like living entities, reaching away from our light in ways that defied physical rules. "James, are your sonar interactions consistent with these shadow movements?" He studied his displays, his face pale against the green glow of the devices. "The contacts are now all around us, but they do not fully reflect sonar. The returns are all incorrect, as if the sound waves are being absorbed rather than reflected back." The water temperature readings persisted in their implausible variations. Thermal spikes that should have boiled the water at the surface came and disappeared on our sensors like phantom heat sources. The pressure data exhibited variations that would have indicated major structural changes in the ocean floor, but our mapping methods found no such topographical features. Sarah, Cheryl's voice was strained and concerned. Look at this example. I turned to see her peering at one of the collection buckets. The black material that had developed in the water sample was moving. Not the random swirling motion of liquid mixing, but deliberate movement as if something inside the container was alive and testing the limits of its confinement. That is not possible. I understand. Cheryl's hands shook slightly when she adjusted the microscope settings, yet it responded to stimuli. When I tap the container, it goes towards the sound. When I flash a light at it, it recoils. The dark substance strained against the collection chamber's walls, as if it were a living thing attempting to escape. Tendrils developed and reassembled, probing the container seal with a worrying level of intelligence. 30,000 feet, Matthew declared over the intercom. All stations prepare for the final descending phase, as if his comments had elicited a response. From the water itself, every system on the ship began shouting alarms at once. Hull pressure alarms, electrical fault indicators, temperature alerts, and the seemingly impossible coordinated breakdown of numerous independent systems. Then, without warning, the radio crackled with static and turned off. Our communication link to the surface had been severed, leaving us utterly alone in the crushing blackness of the deep ocean. The silence that followed was broken only by the sound of our own breathing and the progressively rising frequency of system failure alerts across the ship. We were alone at 30,000 feet, surrounded by water that challenged all we knew about deep-sea physics. Our equipment failing in ways that made no scientific sense, and something dark and clever moving through the samples we had retrieved from the abyss. I grabbed the console's edge as another wave of system failures flooded the ship's monitors. Our radio had been silent for 30 minutes, and the Absol clipper was slowly dying around us. The navigation computers were the first to give up altogether. Matthew was once tracking our descent coordinates. The next moment, he was staring at blank screens that wouldn't respond to any input. He pushed keys with growing intensity, his old fingertips gliding across interfaces that had evolved into ornamental panels. Manual navigation only, he said through gritted teeth. Yet his voice contained an edge I hadn't heard before. The trust that had defined every contact since we left harbor was eroding. The pressure sensors failed next, with their steady digital readouts replaced by error warnings that flashed red against the darkened panels. Our depth gauges followed within minutes, leaving us utterly ignorant to our position in the water column. We may be at 35,000 or 50,000 feet. The crushing weight of the ocean above us was suddenly an unknown magnitude. Cheryl abandoned her microscope station and moved to the backup navigation panel, attempting to get data from systems that were shutting down quicker than we could analyze the problems. Her face was pale in the flickering light of the few still operable displays. She stated that all integrity sensors were offline. The sonar array is down. We're flying blindly. The backup generators kicked in, producing a mechanical whine that echoed throughout the ship's structure. Emergency lights cast a frightening crimson glow over everything, causing our shadows to stretch and dance on the walls like phantoms. The familiar white lead strips that had made the ship feel clean and scientific were gone, replaced by the hellish illumination of a ship in distress. That's when the hull began producing sounds I'd never heard from a deep-sea vessel before. Low murmurs resonated down the passageways, metal speaking under stress in a language unrelated to my training. Deep-sea ships were intended to withstand massive pressure differentials. Their hulls are designed to compress and flex within acceptable ranges. However, these sounds were different. The creaks were inconsistent in size and appeared to originate from random portions of the ship. James worked furiously at his engineering station, bringing up structural diagrams that faded in and out of existence as more systems failed. "These readings don't make sense," he murmured. "The stress patterns are all incorrect for our depth." "What do you mean by wrong?" I asked, moving to see over his shoulder. "The pressure distribution is unequal. It appears like something outside is pushing against certain sections of the hull, rather than the homogeneous pressure expected from water depth." Robert's voice crackled through the failing intercom system on the lower decks. "Captain, there are electrical issues in the main power grid. The generators cycle on and off individually. I am unable to maintain stable power to essential systems." Matthew's reaction was brief and professional, but I could sense the pressure beneath. "Do anything you can. We need life support and ballast control to be operational." The ship groaned again, a deep metallic sigh that seemed to emanate from everywhere at once. The emergency lighting flickered, briefly enveloping us in darkness before returning to its original red glow, except for the sound of our own breathing and the distant buzz of laboring machinery. There was perfect silence in those few seconds of absolute darkness. "How deep are we?" Cheryl inquired, knowing that no one would be able to respond. "Deep charges suggest we passed 35,000 feet. Before the sensors failed," Matthew reacted. "But that happened 20 minutes ago." As if his words had unleashed an ultimate calamity. Suddenly, all of the ship's remaining systems failed. An explorer at the edge of a bottomless ocean trench, spotting a hidden structure with government tags. Unnatural glowing fog leaks from vents. Suspenseful, dark, futuristic. Thick tendrils wrapped around the collection probe. And for a moment, I thought the sludge might prevent us from taking any sample at all. But Cheryl persisted, maneuvering the arm deeper into the undulating mass until the collection chamber sealed with its familiar mechanical click. The sludge released its grip reluctantly, seeming to flow away from the retreating probe with what looked disturbingly like resentment. "Got it," Cheryl announced, though her voice carried none of the satisfaction that usually accompanied successful sample collection. She transferred the sealed chamber to her analysis station and prepared a microscope slide with practiced efficiency. I remained at the external monitoring station, keeping one eye on our cameras while watching her work. The sludge outside continued its slow, rhythmic movement across the seafloor, but I noticed it was gradually shifting position relative to our ship. What had initially appeared random now seemed to be following some kind of pattern, as if the substance was repositioning itself around us. Cheryl bent over her microscope, adjusting the focus with quick, nervous movements. I'd seen her examine thousands of samples during our brief time aboard the ship, and she always approached new specimens with calm scientific curiosity. This time was different. Her shoulders tensed as she peered into the eyepiece, and she made a sharp intake of breath that cut through the low hum of the ship's systems. "What are you seeing?" I asked, moving closer to her station. She didn't answer immediately. Instead, she adjusted the magnification settings and refocused the lens several times, as if trying to convince herself that what she was observing couldn't be real. Her face grew progressively paler, and her hands began shaking more noticeably as she worked the microscope controls. "Cheryl, what is it?" She finally looked up from the eyepiece, her expression a mixture of scientific fascination and absolute horror. "It's not just alive," she whispered. It's organized, structured. There are patterns inside it that look almost like before she could finish the sentence. She stumbled backward from the microscope as if she'd been physically struck. Her chair rolled away from the station, and she pointed at the sample container. With a trembling finger, the black sludge in the collection chamber was moving. Not the random swirling motion we'd observed in the earlier water samples, but deliberate, purposeful movement. The substance pressed against the walls of the glass container, forming tendrils that explored the surface like fingers, testing for weakness. It flowed upward along the sides of the chamber, defying gravity in ways that violated basic physics, then pulled at the top before dropping back down to repeat the process. That's impossible, I said, though I was watching it happen with my own eyes. The sludge continued its exploration of the container, forming increasingly complex shapes as it moved. Spiral patterns that reminded me of DNA helixes. Geometric formations that looked like crystalline structures. Brief moments where the substance seemed to organize itself into something that resembled neural networks, complete with branching pathways that pulsed with darker veins of material. Then, as if responding to our observation, the entire mass of sludge outside the ship began to move. The external cameras showed waves of black substance rising from the ocean floor in massive coordinated surges. These weren't the random undulations we'd observed when we first reached the bottom. The sludge was lifting itself in enormous sheets that stretched beyond the range of our lights, creating walls of dark material that towered above our ship like liquid mountains. The first wave struck the Absal Clipper's hull with tremendous force, sending shock waves through the ship's frame that knocked both Cheryl and me off balance. The impact wasn't the gentle contact of deep-sea currents against a stationary object. It felt deliberate, as if something massive had deliberately struck our vessel to test its structural integrity. "Captain," I called into the intercom, "we're taking impacts from the external mass. Recommend immediate ascent." Matthew's voice crackled back through the speakers, but the transmission was distorted by increasing electrical interference. Trying to activate ballast tanks. Controls are not responding properly. Another wave of sludge crashed against the ship, this time from a different angle. The hull groaned under the impact, and several of our external lights flickered and went dark. Through the remaining cameras, I could see that we were being completely surrounded. The black substance had risen from the seafloor to form a writhing dome around the Absal Clipper, cutting off our view of the open ocean beyond. "Emergency ascent protocols," Matthew announced over the intercom, his voice tight with controlled urgency. "All hands prepare for rapid decompression sequence." But when he tried to activate the ballast release system, nothing happened. The controls that should have emptied our ballast tanks and sent us rocketing toward the surface remained completely unresponsive. Every button press, every switch activation produced no result, as if the ship's fundamental systems had been severed from their mechanical connections. The electrical interference was getting worse. Monitor displays flickered with static, and the ship's internal lighting dimmed and brightened in irregular patterns. That reminded me uncomfortably of the sludge's own rhythmic movements outside our hull. That's when I noticed the first signs of infiltration. A thin line of black substance was seeping through a ventilation grate near the ceiling of the equipment bay. The vent should have been sealed against water intrusion at these depths, protected by multiple redundant barriers designed to prevent exactly this kind of breach. But the sludge was finding its way inside anyway, flowing through gaps that shouldn't have existed in a properly functioning deep-sea vessel. "Cheryl, look at the ceiling." She followed my gaze and went rigid when she saw the black material beginning to drip from the ventilation system. The droplets didn't fall like normal liquid. They moved with purpose, flowing upward along the walls and spreading in patterns that suggested they were actively exploring the ship's interior layout. More infiltration points appeared throughout the compartment. The sludge squeezed through. Seals around door frames emerged from electrical conduits and began seeping up through what appeared to be microscopic gaps in the deck plating. Within minutes, thin streams of the black substance were entering the ship from dozens of different locations. Simultaneously, Robert's voice crackled over the failing intercom system from the engineering decks below. "Captain, we've got some kind of contamination down here. Black substance coming through the bulkheads. It's eating through the metal-like acid. Can you contain it?" Matthew's response was nearly drowned out by static. "Negative. It's spreading too fast. We're seeing structural damage to primary systems." James is trying to. The transmission cut off abruptly, replaced by silence that was somehow more alarming than any emergency report. I grabbed the internal communications handset and tried to re-establish contact with the lower decks. "Robert, respond." "James, please respond." My calls were answered just with static. The muck in our cubicle was spreading faster now. Individual streams connected to form larger pools that moved across the floor with predatory fluidity. It wasn't just flowing downward or following the ship's orientation. The substance was actively seeking, sending exploring tendrils towards our feet as the main bulk positioned itself between us and the escape. "We need to get out of here," Cheryl murmured, backing up toward the passage leading to the top decks. But when she got to the doorway, she paused and let out a little, startled gasp. The hallway beyond was already ankle-deep in the flowing black stuff, and more was coming in through every aperture. The ship's entire lower half was compromised. A sound sounded from somewhere below us, and my blood froze. A scream cut so quickly that it was evident that whatever caused it was instantaneous and fatal. Then another scream, this time longer but ending with the same horrifying suddenness. James and Robert were gone. I glanced at the muck moving across our floor and recognized with certainty that we hadn't accidentally upset some mysterious deep-sea critter. The black substance was hunting us with intellect and intent, using the ship's own systems against us. It dissolved everything it came into contact with. It had isolated us, closed off our escape routes, and was now closing in with the patience of something much older than human civilization. The Absol Clipper was no longer our means of exploration. It had become our grave, and something old and terrible was guaranteeing that none of us would emerge from the bottom of the ocean alive. I turned from the doorway where Cheryl stood, transfixed, and looked at the ankle-deep sludge that filled the passage beyond our compartment. The black stuff was now traveling quicker, entering our equipment compartment through various entry points, like a concerted assault. We had only seconds before it blocked off any chance of escape. "The safe room," I whispered, grasping Cheryl's arm and dragging her away from the compromised exit. "There is an emergency chamber on the upper deck." We dashed toward the maintenance ladder that led to the ship's upper decks. The sludge pursued us with liquid tentacles that extended across the floor like grabbing fingers. I could hear it behind us. A moist sliding sound became louder as more of the substance spilled through the ship's crumbling walls. The concluding rungs were sticky with dampness, but we climbed with urgent speed, emerging on the upper deck, which housed the ship's emergency systems. The safe room was placed into the structure as a reinforced chamber to safeguard crew members from catastrophic hull breaches or fire crises. I saw it on our first trip, but I never believed I'd need it. Behind us, Black muck started rushing up through the deck access hatch we had just ascended. The substance resisted gravity, climbing upward along the walls and ceiling as if it had never understood the laws that govern ordinary stuff. It formed branching patterns that reminded me of blood veins or neural networks. Each tendril probed and tested the ship's structure as it moved. The safe room door was a large steel barrier with manual locks that needed physical power to open. I threw my weight against the first wheel lock while Cheryl worked on the second. We were both pushing against devices that were not intended to operate quickly. The locks finally gave way, producing metallic grinding sounds that echoed across the passageway. More crew voices echoed around the ship. Panicked yells and calls for assistance broke through the mechanical moaning of the vessels. Stressed hull. I recognized Tom's voice from engineering, then Lisa's from navigation, both screaming in terror before their voices were abruptly cut off. The black sludge hunted throughout the ship, at the same time, seeking and destroying anyone who remained alive with efficiency. We pushed through the safe room entrance just as the first tendrils of sludge appeared in the corridor where we stood. I slammed the heavy door behind us, frantically rotating the internal wheel locks. As Cheryl activated the chamber's emergency sealing system, as the area became isolated from the ship's degraded atmosphere, pressurized air hissed through the walls. The secure room was much smaller than I had anticipated, just big enough for individuals to stand comfortably. Emergency supplies lined the walls, including sealed water containers, oxygen tanks, rudimentary medical equipment, and communication devices. The sole view outside the compartment was through a small round porthole. Its strong glasses, designed to endure huge pressure differentials. Through the porthole, I could see into the ship's main corridor, where Matthew was pushing his way through the spreading muck. The skipper moved with desperate resolve, pushing against the black stuff that had now reached his waist as he strained for the manual ballast controls. The muck clung to his legs like thick mud, yet he took each step forward with sheer effort. Cheryl pressed her face against the porthole alongside me, watching Matthew's progress with frightened curiosity. "He's attempting to contact the emergency systems," she muttered. The manual ballast release was housed in a recessed panel near the ship's central communication station. Matthew had to wade through ever deeper filth to get there. The black stuff rose around him, as if it understood his goals and was attempting to keep him from succeeding. "Come on," I found myself urging, knowing that he couldn't hear me through the sealed chamber walls. Cheryl left the porthole and moved toward the corridor that connected to the main hallway, apparently thinking she could help him somehow. But when she reached for the safe room's inner door controls, I grabbed her arm. "Do not open it. Sludge will also get in here." She pulled away from me with startling force. "We can't simply watch him die." Before I could stop her, she had activated the door's manual override and was returning to the ship's main corridor. The sludge instantly began to pour toward the open safe room entrance, but Cheryl managed to close the chamber door from the outside, sealing herself in the corridor with the oncoming black mass. Through the porthole, I watched her slog through the mud toward Matthew, who was almost at the ballast controls. The substance had reached her knees, and then her waist, moving with predatory intelligence as it detected another victim within reach. She moved forward regardless, extending her hand to Matthew as he struggled to grasp the emergency switch. The muck surged up around Cheryl's legs, spreading with horrifying speed and enveloping her entire body. She shouted, and the sound penetrated the secure room's thick walls, and I put my hands on the porthole glass, as if I could reach through to pull her back. "Help me," she yelled, staring directly at the porthole where I stood, helpless in terror. The black substance was now covering her chest, flowing upward with the deliberate patience of something aware that its prey could not escape. Matthew turned at the sound of her voice and saw what was happening. Instead of heading toward the ballast controls, he turned course and battled his way through the thickening muck toward Cheryl. However, he was too late. The dark mass swallowed her completely. Her final scream cut short as the slime smothered her face and head. Only a slightly human-shaped mound of writhing blackness remained where Cheryl had been standing, and it melted into the greater mass in seconds. Matthew stared at the location where she had vanished, his face a mask of wrath and resolve. Then he returned to the ballast controls, crawling with fresh urgency through the sludge, which was now nearly chest deep. Each step was a monumental effort, but he kept pushing forward until he reached the recessed panel. The manual ballast release was covered by a safety cover that required two-handed operation. To prevent accidental activation, Matthew strained with the mechanism, and the black muck rose about his shoulders as he worked. Finally, the cover swung open to reveal the bright red emergency lever underneath. He returned his gaze to the safe room porthole, where his eyes met mine through the thick glass. Even from a distance, I could see the awareness in his expression. The realization that pressing the lever would preserve the spacecraft but likely cost him his life. "Stay hidden until you reach the surface," he screamed, though his voice was muffled by the room walls. "Don't let them cover it up." Then he pulled the emergency ballast release lever with both hands, slamming his full weight against the mechanism until it clicked into place. The ship shuddered violently as the ballast tanks emptied, releasing thousands of gallons of water that had been holding us steady at depth. The unexpected buoyancy change sent ripples through the entire vessel, and I felt the floor tilt as the Absol Clipper began its emergency ascent toward the surface. The sludge enveloping Matthew looked to convulse with the ship's movement, spilling over his head and shoulders as he vanished into the black mass. His final words echoed in my mind as I watched the substance, where he had been standing, slowly settle and spread across the corridor floor. The ascent was violent and uncontrolled, without computer systems to govern the rate of rise. The ship surged upward into the water column at deadly speed. The hull groaned and creaked with the changing pressure, metal plates expanding and contracting. As we moved from the crushing depths to the surface far above, through the porthole, I could see the sludge filling the ship's carters, flowing like black water as the vessel's orientation varied during ascent. But it wasn't behaving like regular liquid. The substance moved against the ship's speed, running up the walls and pooling in places that should not have been possible given our angle of climb. It was evaluating the safe room's door seals. I could hear it outside the chamber, a moist, sliding sound as tendrils of sludge probed around the door frame, searching for any opening or weakness that may enable admission. The seals remained intact, but the constant testing never ended. For hours, the black substance continued its patient exploration of every inch of the chamber's exterior, pressing against the barriers that separated it from its final victim. The temperature inside the safe area began lowering as we soared through the ocean's thermal layers. At depth, the water temperature had been slightly above freezing, but the chamber's insulation and my body heat had kept the interior comfortable. As we ascended, the changing pressure and the ship's damaged environmental systems allowed cold to seep through the walls. I covered myself in an emergency blanket from the supply cupboard and settled against the chamber's back wall as far from the porthole as possible. I didn't want to witness what was going in the passageways outside, but I could still hear the sludge moving around the ship, a steady moist sound that suggested it was permeating every compartment and absorbing everything it came across. Hours have passed. I rationed the emergency water supply, taking little sips from sealed containers while attempting to maintain body heat. The safe room's air recycling system remained operational, providing a breathing environment even as the rest of the ship's systems collapsed around us. The ascent seemed to take forever, without working chronometers or depth gauges. I had no method of tracking our progress, other than the gradually changing noises of the hull under pressure. The metal groaning became less distinct as we rose, signaling lower water pressure, but we were still a long way from the surface. Exhaustion started taking its toll. I found myself slipping in and out of sleep, jolted awake by some new sound from outside the chamber. Sometimes it was the hull settling as pressure changed. Other times, the sludge tested the door seals with fresh vigor, as if it realized I was weakening and becoming more vulnerable. 18 hours after Matthew had pulled the emergency ballast release, I felt the ship's motion change from the smooth vertical ascent to the rolling movement of surface waves. The Absol Clipper had broken through to the surface world, transporting me and its cargo of Black Death back to the land of sunlight and breathable air. But I remained locked in the safe room, listening to the sludge moving through the ship's hallways, knowing that opening the chamber door would result in immediate death. I'd survived the ascent, but I was still imprisoned with something that had already killed everyone else on board, and I had no idea how long I could hide before it found a way in. I counted my breaths in the dark and secure chamber, utilizing the rhythm to keep track of the passing hours. The ship's motion had shifted sometime during my imprisonment, which I judged to be the 23rd hour. The smooth vertical movement of ascension is replaced by the familiar rolling of surface waves. We had made it through to the world above. The rolling motion evoked a mixture of relief and horror. We were relieved to have fled the crushing depths where that black mass had engulfed my colleagues. Terror because I was still confined in a vessel that had been completely penetrated by something that violated every physical law I knew. I strained my ear to the safe room door, listening for any sounds of movement in the passageways beyond. The wet, sliding noise that had been bothering me throughout the ascent had completely stopped. No further testing of door seals. No more liquid investigation of the vessel's innards. The silence felt almost as strange as the sounds had been. I still waited. 2 more hours passed before I mustered the confidence to unlock the chamber door. My hands shook as I cranked the manual wheel locks, the metallic grinding echoing across the confined room. The seals released with a gentle hiss of equalizing pressure. The corridor beyond was empty. Not only is it empty of black filth, but of everything. Thick streams of dark stuff had spilled along the walls and pulled on the floor. Only stains remained. Black markings covered every surface, like fire patterns. Yet the muck had vanished entirely. The ship appeared to have been swept by fire, leaving only the charred remains of what had happened. I proceeded cautiously through the corridors, inspecting each compartment for any traces of my deceased colleagues, or the chemical that had killed them. The equipment bay where Cheryl and I had worked had been gutted. All scientific instruments are destroyed or melted into unrecognizable shapes. The walls were coated in black stains that formed branching patterns, reminiscent of lightning strikes or blood arteries. The lower decks were terrible. Entire sections of bulkhead had been eaten away, resulting in holes in the ship's construction that should have allowed water to flood the compartments. However, the ship remained afloat, despite damage that should have taken us to the ocean below. I found no sign of Matthew, Cheryl, James, Robert, or any of the other crew members. Not their bodies, their clothes, or the equipment they were carrying. The sludge had eaten all organic matter, leaving only the ship's damaged skeleton. The bridge was my last stop. The navigational computers were destroyed. Their displays had broken and faded. The radio system had been reduced to a pile of melted parts and severed wires. However, the emergency beacon panel remained intact, with the red activation switch glittering under the emergency illumination. I pressed the switch with shaky fingers, hearing the familiar electronic whine as the beacon broadcast our location and distress signal. After what I'd been through in the depths, the sound felt reassuringly normal. Exhaustion struck me like a bodily weight. The adrenaline that had kept me aware during the ascent had drained completely, leaving me with bone-deep tiredness and the realization that I hadn't eaten or drank anything substantial in almost 24 hours. My legs gave out, and I dropped near the beacon panel, my body finally understanding the cost of overcoming the impossible. Dehydration left my mouth, feeling like sandpaper. My lips were cracked, and swallowing became uncomfortable. The safe room's emergency water supply had lasted longer than anticipated, but rationing the little containers for 26 hours had left me severely exhausted. The ship's galley may contain more supplies, but I lacked the strength to hunt for them. I lay on the bridge floor, listening to the emergency beacon's constant electronic pulse and the ship's gradual motion. On surface waves, genuine waves from the genuine ocean, not the strange habitat we encountered in the deep trench. I concentrated on these common sounds, using them to connect me to the familiar world above the darkness. 6 hours had passed before I heard the engines of an approaching vessel. The sound gradually became louder, until I could hear the distinct thrumming of big military propellers cutting through the sea. Based on the engine's signature and the synchronized efficiency of their approach, this appears to be a U.S. Navy ship. Voices echoed across the lake as they approached the Absol clipper. Professional commands and status reports revealed that this was a trained rescue effort, rather than an accidental contact with a passing vessel. Someone had received our emergency beacon and dispatched the appropriate resources to react. The boarding group walked around the ship with little practice, their heavy boots echoing in the ruined hallways as they made a first assessment. I heard them call out room clearances and structural evaluations, which are terms used by military personnel, conducting a thorough search. Survivor located on the bridge. When they found me, they heard a voice say something. 2 sailors in Navy uniforms lifted me gingerly, supporting my weight as my parched muscles tried to function. They wrapped me in thermal blankets and transported me over to their ship, where a medical officer was waiting for fluids and emergency treatment equipment. The medical bay was clean and bright, everything functioning just as designed. Normal equipment is used by normal persons using normal techniques. After the strange terror of the deep water, the systematic efficiency of military medical felt like a return to civilization. The medical officer, a serious woman with lieutenant's bars and soft hands, began in for drip and watched my vital signs while asking detailed questions about my condition. She handled the extreme dehydration with professional competence, regulating the fluid flow until my body began to accept the badly required water. Her questioning, however, were beyond the scope of medical evaluation. She wanted to know about the rest of the crew, about what had happened during our fall, about how I had survived when nobody else had. Her questions came with the meticulous precision of someone who has been briefed on more than simply emergency medicine. As the 4 fluids cleared the fog from my mind, I informed her that there were 7 other people on board the ship. The captain, my research partner, and the engineering crew are all dead. She shared a glance with the Navy officer who was standing silently near the medical bay entrance. That glance had weight and meaning that extended beyond worry about missing people. "What happened to them?" she asked, her tone bland yet attentive. I attempted to describe the black sludge, how it moved with intelligence and purpose, and how I saw it swallow my colleagues one by one. Even as I spoke, the words sounded strange, like the musings of someone who had spent too much time alone on a broken vessel. The stuff emerged from the water floor, I remarked, scanning their expressions for signs of belief or understanding. It wasn't simply living. It was pursuing us. It disintegrated metal, defied gravity, and killed all who came into contact with it. The medical officer continued her work without comment, but I noticed another crucial exchange between her and the Navy officer. Their expressions reflected the courteous skepticism of professionals dealing with someone whose grasp on reality had been shaken by trauma. The medical officer calmly explained that hallucinations are typical in circumstances of extreme oxygen deprivation and dehydration, combined with the psychological pain of losing your co-workers in what was clearly a horrific accident. Your mind may have devised explanations for experiences that were too overwhelming to comprehend ordinarily. I'm not hallucinating, I insisted, despite the uncertainty in their voices, which made me question my own memory. The sludge was genuine. It killed them. The Navy officer stepped forward. His expression was sympathetic yet forceful. Miss, we've examined your sailboat. There is evidence of a significant hull breach and catastrophic system failure. Your co-workers most likely died when the ship lost pressure integrity during descent. You survived because you got to the emergency safe room before the worst of the harm happened. Their interpretations seemed rational and logical, based on evidence that they could see and measure. My story about intelligent black sludge sounded like a desperate fantasy from someone whose mind had broken under stress. Even I was beginning to question if the dehydration and isolation had corrupted my memories of what had actually occurred in the depths. They took me to a military hospital in Hawaii, where I spent the next 3 days recovering under close medical monitoring. The hospital was modern and well-equipped, with experienced doctors who addressed my physical condition professionally and efficiently. But I observed the guards stationed outside my door, armed individuals who claimed to be there for my safety, but whose presence felt more like confinement. My room had no phone, no internet, and no ability to contact anyone outside of the hospital. The physician stated that this was a precaution while I recovered from my ordeal, but the isolation seemed intentional. They kept me in communication while they determined what to do with my narrative. On my 3rd day in the hospital, after the doctors had deemed me medically well and psychologically stable, a man in a black suit came into my room. He introduced himself as David Miller, from a government agency I'd never heard of, and carried a huge folder with an attitude that suggested our chat would be anything but ordinary. He pulled a chair next my bed and sat down with the patience of someone who has done similar interviews many times before. His presence infused the room with authority, making the armed guards outside appear redundant. "Ms. Campbell," he said, opening his folder and showing documents that I couldn't read due to my position. "We need to talk about what happened aboard the Absol Clipper." David Miller's presence altered everything in the sterile medical room. His black suit appeared to be costly, tailored to someone who went through government offices and confidential briefings with ease. The folder in his hands was thick enough to carry an entire life's worth of documentation, and something about the cautious manner he handled it suggested it probably did. I shifted my posture in the hospital bed, immediately realizing that my medical gown and furline would place me at a significant disadvantage in whatever talk we were going to have. Miller's expression remained politely neutral, but his eyes revealed the calculating intelligence of someone who had mastered the art of extracting information from hesitant subjects. Before we begin, he continued, opening the folder and pulling out a large document. I need you to understand the legal framework that governs our discussion. He carefully placed the papers on my bed so that I could plainly read the header. The document was labeled Confidentiality Agreement Classified Operation Division, in large letters that appeared to terrify anyone who saw them. Miller reclined back in his chair, giving me time to scan the first page of dense legal writing. The terminology used was sophisticated and frightening, with references to national security processes and criminal repercussions for illegal disclosure of secret material. One section mentioned possible prosecution under the Espionage Act, while another described financial penalties that would bankrupt me for the rest of my life. Miss Campbell, the Absol Clipper mission is classified at a level well beyond your security clearance, Miller explained as I struggled to understand the legal terms. Everything you experienced on that mission is now an issue of national security. Therefore, discussing it with unauthorized people would be a federal felony. The nonchalant way he gave this information indicated that he had given similar talks previously. His tone indicated that he was providing straightforward facts rather than threatening my freedom. But the underlying message was clear. According to the official record, your vessel encountered a catastrophic hull breach during its descent to operational depth. He continued, removing more paperwork from his folder. System failures resulted in increasing flooding, killing all crew members. Save yourself. You survived by making it to the emergency life support pod, where you remained until rescue crews found your vessel. Miller spoke as if reading from a screenplay. Each phrase was carefully picked to form a coherent narrative that described all I had seen. His explanation was clear, reasonable, and entirely wrong. That is not what happened. I explained, my voice sounding softer than I intended. There was something down there that had murdered them. Miller nodded patiently, as if he expected this remark. He dug into his folder again and pulled out a series of images, putting them around my bed like playing cards. The photographs showed the Absol Clipper being pulled by a big military vessel into what seemed to be a strongly defended naval base. Cranes and sophisticated equipment surrounded the wrecked ship, as personnel wearing hazardous suits carefully examined the hull. The images captured every aspect of the operation with professional precision. Miller stated to me as I inspected the photographs that your vessel is currently being researched in a secure facility. Teams of engineers and material specialists are examining the damage patterns to discover what caused the structural catastrophe. He referred to specific images of the ship's damaged portions, where the black sludge had eaten through metal armor and jeopardized the hull's integrity. However, in these photographs, the damage appeared to be regular corrosion and metal fatigue, not the unimaginable annihilation I had experienced. The families of your colleagues have already been notified, Miller said, his voice full of finality. They have received the official explanation, as well as hefty recompense for their losses. The grieving process has begun, depending on the facts they have received. The weight of the words struck me like a physical blow. Cheryl's family mourned her death based on a lie. Matthew's relatives were told he died in an industrial accident, not the heroic sacrifice I had witnessed. They had all been robbed of the truth about how their loved ones perished. I took the secrecy agreement and read through the portions that explained my commitments to be completely silent regarding any secret components of the operation. The document was extensive and threatening, evidently produced by lawyers who specialized in national security situations. I'm not signing this, I responded, pushing the papers back to Miller. People deserve to know what's under there. Miller's demeanor remained unchanged, but he went for his folder once more and pulled out a separate batch of paperwork. These pages provided detailed information about my personal life, credit reports, employment history, financial information, and background checks dating back years. He read the first page, which showed $47,000 in student loan debt. Currently unemployed with few prospects in your field. Jennifer, your sister in Portland, lost her job 6 months ago and is currently behind on her rent. Last year, your mother's cancer treatment-related medical bills destroyed the majority of the family's resources. He continued to read details that provided a thorough picture of my financial weakness and family duties. Information about Jennifer's unemployment benefits running out, my mother's constant pharmaceutical expenditures, and the dire financial circumstances that had prompted me to accept the unusual expedition offer in the first place. We understand that financial pressure can lead to poor decisions, Miller replied, shutting the file and looking at me with what appeared to be sympathy. But we also understand that most people want to protect their families from unnecessary hardship. The threat was conveyed with professional respect, but the consequences were plain. Refusing to sign would have far-reaching ramifications for my own career chances. My family's financial stability was dependent on my involvement in this cover-up. Miller removed a pen from his jacket and placed it beside the secrecy agreement. Miss Campbell, the choice is yours. But I should point out that the Department of Education has just introduced new policies addressing student debt forgiveness for persons who have been traumatized by government-related situations. Even the inducements were framed as threats. Sign the forms to receive financial assistance. Refuse and watch my family bear the consequences of my convictions. I picked up the pen and felt its weight like a chain around my wrist. Every signature I made would add another link to the chains that would keep me mute for the rest of my life. But Jennifer's face appeared in my thoughts, along with my mother's troubled expression, as she discussed the medical expenditures that continued to pile up despite her insurance coverage. The signing process took less than 2 minutes. My name appeared on page after page of legal paperwork, transferring my quiet into the hands of whichever agency Miller represented. Each signature felt like a small death, a bit of truth buried beneath layers of official lies and national security categories. Miller collected the papers with practiced efficiency, putting them back in his folder with the images and background research. He stood up from his chair, straightening his suit jacket in gestures that suggested our business was done. Thank you for your cooperation, Miss Campbell, he added, holding out his hand for a traditional handshake. Someone will be in touch regarding your discharge procedures. 2 days later, I was back in my Seattle apartment, sitting on the same couch where I had read the mystery email that started it all. The drive from San Diego Harbor to this point felt like moving between worlds. However, the familiar surroundings could not obliterate the memories of what I had witnessed in the depths. My laptop was still where I left it, with the desktop backdrop shot of a coral reef I had taken during graduate studies. After what I had seen, the image appeared absurdly bright and cheerful. A memory of the ocean's beauty before I discovered the horrors it could hide. The email notification sound brought my attention to my inbox, where a message from Pacific Marine Research Institute sat alongside the usual spam and adverts. The sender's address showed it was from their Human Resources Department, but the subject line made my hands tremble as I clicked to open it. Employment opportunity for a senior marine biologist. The email described a research position that well exceeded any career goal I had hoped to achieve at this point in my life. Senior researcher position at a prestigious institute. Access to cutting-edge facilities. and a salary that would cover my student debt in 2 years. The benefits package included full medical coverage, retirement contributions, and research grants to assist whatever subject I wanted to pursue. The role had one major criterion. All research activities would be subject to government supervision and categorization evaluation. Any discoveries or publications would require permission from undisclosed federal entities before being released to the scientific community. My laptop screen reflected my face as I glanced at the offer, revealing the hollow expression of someone who had sacrificed truth for comfort. The job was everything I had worked for, presented to me as a reward for my silence on the most important discovery in human history. Days progressed into weeks as I tried to convince myself that accepting the employment was the practical choice. Jennifer secured new employment. My student loan relief went through just as Miller had said, and my mother's medical bills were more bearable thanks to my new insurance advantages. Everything in my life improved drastically, with the exception of the knowledge, which ate at me like acid every time I closed my eyes. The black muck lingered in my mind continually during quiet periods at work. While perusing trivial coral biology studies, my thoughts returned to the way that substance had moved with purposeful intelligence. I remembered how it had stalked through the ship's hallways, devouring my colleagues and leaving no trace behind. Miller's images depicted the Absal clipper being hauled away for private study. But what happened to the samples Cheryl had collected? Was the black mass still alive in some government lab, being researched by researchers who had no idea what they were looking at? Alternatively, it may have been returned to the deep depths, where it could develop and spread until anything disturbed it. The official story concerning the hull rupture and pressure failure was published in various marine safety journals, warning about the risks of deep-sea exploration in undiscovered waters. My co-workers were remembered as victims of an industrial disaster, their true heroism hidden beneath layers of classification and corporate liability protection. 3 months after returning to Seattle, I made an anonymous account on a deep web forum focused on unexplained phenomena and government cover-ups. The users were largely conspiracy theorists and attention seekers, but it was the only location where I could speak the truth without breaking my confidentiality agreement. I wrote everything: the mystery expedition offer, the plunge into the pit, the black sludge that defied physics and devoured my research team. Every detail was spilled out in a lengthy piece that seemed like science fiction to anyone who hadn't been through it. The replies were just what I expected: skepticism, requests for proof, and allegations that I was producing creative fiction for internet points. A few individuals claimed to have had comparable experiences with inexplicable ocean phenomena, but their accounts were so vague and inadequately documented that they appeared to be attempts to seek attention rather than genuine encounters. Nobody believed me, which was probably exactly what Miller and his agency expected when they allowed me to maintain my memories. The truth seemed so inconceivable that telling it made me appear insane, while the official version presented a sensible explanation that met everyone's desire for logical conclusions. But I continued to write postings on that site, adding details and insight as they came to me. Something old and wicked lurked in trenches that appeared on no official charts. Somewhere in the Pacific Ocean's depths, it had killed 7 individuals with casual efficiency, and the only reason I lived was sheer luck mixed with Matthew's final sacrifice. The black sludge was still there, patient and clever, in depths where no human mission was supposed to go. And, despite all the classification agreements and government cover-ups, despite the cushy employment and financial security that kept me quiet, I knew that one day Another research vessel would get cryptic coordinates and an offer to good to pass up. When that happened, I would be the only person alive who understood where they were headed.